All rise. Voulez-vous lever? The International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals is now in session. L'audience du mécanisme international appelé à exercer les fonctions résiduelles des tribunaux pénaux est ouverte. Please be seated.
Good morning, everyone. Today marks the opening of the trial of Mr. Félicien Kabuga. It is the understanding of the chamber that Mr. Kabuga is this morning well, but has decided that he would not attend today's proceedings either in person or by using the VTC facility available to him. The chamber has decided that the appropriate course to take in these circumstances is to proceed with the trial nevertheless. Before we move to opening statements, I would like to welcome to this bench Judge Mustafa El-Baj, who's on my right. He has replaced Judge Gatti on the bench. And to welcome also Judge Margaret de Guzman, who's on my extreme right, appointed as the trial chamber reserve judge. I'd like to express the appreciation of the remaining members of the bench to Judge Gatti for her dedication to the Kabuga case during the pre-trial phase, and wish her well in her new capacity as president of the mechanism. With that, I now invite the prosecution to make its opening statement. Mr. Rashid.
Good morning, Your Honours. Good morning, colleagues. This case concerns Félicien Kabuga and his individual responsibility for serious crimes committed during the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda between the 7th of April and 17th of July 1994. This trial starts today, 28 years after the genocide, because of Félicien Kabuga's determined efforts to evade responsibility and accountability. When the genocide ended in July 1994, Kabuga fled Rwanda to neighboring Zaire. He traveled to Switzerland, where he sought and was denied asylum. Kabuga was indicted by the ICTR. Instead of surrendering to stand trial, he fled and lived as a fugitive. He remained in hiding for decades. In 2011 and 2012, the ICTR held special deposition proceedings under Mechanism Rule 78 to preserve the evidence in cases against its remaining fugitives. Witnesses testified and were cross-examined by duty counsel representing Kabuga's interests. Many of these witnesses will give evidence before the trial chamber in these proceedings. In May 2020, Kabuga was traced to a modest apartment outside Paris, where he was living under an assumed name. He was arrested and transferred to Mechanism custody in The Hague. In March 2021, the prosecution filed the operative indictment. The charges against Kabuga reflects his status as a wealthy and well-connected political insider. In support of the genocide, Kabuga did not need to wield a rifle or a machete at a roadblock. Rather, he supplied weapons in bulk and facilitated the training that prepared the Interahamwe to use them. He did not need to pick up a microphone to call for extermination of Tutsi on the radio. Rather, he founded, funded, and served as president of the Radio Télévision Libre de Mille Collines, RTLM, the radio station that broadcast genocidal propaganda across Rwanda. Kabuga is not the first businessman to face prosecution for his contributions to the most serious international crimes. There is long-standing historical precedent for prosecuting those who use their money and connections for such ends. The Nuremberg military tribunals held 3 trials charging dozens of German industrialists for participating in and supporting Nazi atrocities. Those proceedings illustrate the importance of financial and logistical support to the perpetration of large-scale crimes, even from outside the formal hierarchy of the state and its security apparatus. Kabuga's acts and conducts from at least 1992 paint a consistent picture of anti-Tutsi animus that propelled him to support the genocide. Kabuga supported the Interahamwe at the national level while establishing local groups in Kigali, at his home in Kimironko, and at a large commercial building he owned in Muhima. He led efforts to establish RTLM as a mouthpiece for anti-Tutsi propaganda, while Interahamwe were indoctrinated in similar messages on his properties. In late 1993 and early 1994, he defended RTLM's incendiary broadcasts at the ministerial level as they grew more violent toward the Tutsi and their supposed accomplices. Around the same time, Kabuga began arming his Interahamwe with the weapons they later used in the genocide. In late February or March 1994, Kabuga spoke at a rally in Musave, close to Kigali. Witness Cab 053 will testify that Kabuga was introduced as the guest of honor. He called the Tutsi the enemy and likened them to snakes, warning that if you see a snake and you don't kill that snake will bite you. He promised money, equipment, and vehicles to aid in fighting the Tutsi. Witness Cab 085 will testify that on the day of the rally, Tutsi were attacked by Interahamwe and their property was looted. Then came the genocide. On the evening of 6th April 1994, Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana was aboard an aeroplane returning from Tanzania with the President of Burundi and various senior Rwandan government officials. At around 8:30 p.m., the presidential plane was shot down near Kigali airport as it approached to land. Everyone on board was killed. In the early hours of 7th April, leading moderate politicians, mostly Hutu, from opposition political parties were systematically targeted and killed in Kigali. Groups of Rwandan Armed Forces, or RAF soldiers, and armed militias began openly killing unarmed Tutsi civilians and raping Tutsi women in their homes and in the streets. Roadblocks were erected by soldiers, Interahamwe, and other armed militia groups who checked identity cards and arrested and killed Tutsi. Roadblocks sprang up throughout Kigali and across Rwanda, at which Tutsi were identified, arrested, raped, and killed. Witnesses will describe seeing thousands of bodies strewn about, clogging public roads and waterways. As these gruesome scenes of mass murder unfolded, RTLM, Kabuga's radio station, was broadcasting urgent, enthusiastic calls to genocide, and the Interahamwe Kabuga supported were on the streets hunting down and killing Tutsi. Kabuga's support for the genocide did not waver. When RTLM's offices in Kiyovu were shelled in the middle of April 1994, Kabuga went to the scene and provided encouragement and gave financial support for the injured. He voiced RTLM's genocidal message in person at meetings, rallies, and even individual roadblocks, calling explicitly for the extermination of the enemy Tutsi. When he moved to Gisenyi, he held fundraisers to purchase weapons. He imported weapons in violation of an arms embargo. He personally appeared at roadblocks to distribute weapons and encourage the Interahamwe to accelerate the killings. When they succeeded, he congratulated and rewarded them. By 17th of July 1994, an estimated 800,000 people had been killed in just over 100 days. Hundreds of thousands were victims of rape and sexual assault. As the ICTR Appeals Chamber held in the case of Prosecutor versus Karimera, there is no reasonable basis for anyone to dispute that during 1994, there was a campaign of mass killing intended to destroy in whole, or at least in part, Rwanda's Tutsi population. The appeals chamber went on to conclude that, and I quote, "The fact of the Rwandan genocide is a part of world history, a fact as certain as any other, a classic instance of a fact of common knowledge," unquote. 28 years after the events, this trial is about holding Félicien Kabuga accountable for his substantial and intentional contributions to that genocide. I will begin with a few words about Félicien Kabuga, followed by an overview of the political context that set the stage for the genocide. And then Mr. Elderkin will then outline the evidence proving Kabuga's criminal responsibility, first by founding and supporting RTLM, and second by arming, training, and encouraging the Interahamwe. Félicien Kabuga was born in Byumba Prefecture in northeastern Rwanda. He founded a small trading company that grew over decades into a sprawling network of business interests: a flour mill, a tea plantation, an import-export firm, factories, extensive real estate, a large fleet of trucks and commercial vehicles. By 1994, he had over $1 million in one Rwandan bank account alone. He was widely known as one of the richest men in Rwanda. You will hear in this trial from numerous witnesses that Kabuga commanded great respect among business, political, and military leaders across Rwanda. This reputation derived from both his wealth and his political connections and influence. He had an intimate relationship with President Juvenal Habyarimana, who held a monopoly over political power as chairman of the only political party permitted under the Constitution and head of states since 1973. Two of Kabuga's daughters married Habyarimana's sons. The evidence in this trial will show that Kabuga had privileged access to Habyarimana and the ability to leverage that access to promote causes and raise funds. He used that access to arrange meetings at the president's private residence and successfully lobbied Habyarimana to support both RTLM and the Interahamwe. Kabuga was an active and prominent member of Habyarimana's party, the MRND, which until 1991 was the only political party in Rwanda. He was a major financial donor. For a period in the early 1990s, the MRND headquarters was even housed in the large commercial building he had constructed in the Muhima sector of Kigali. When a new MRND party statute was adopted in August 1991, he was among the prominent members representing Byumba Prefecture. Kabuga routinely appeared on stage at important MRND rallies with the highest party officials, including President Habyarimana and MRND Chairman Matthew Ngirumpatse. Kabuga was venerated as an august guest and major thunder of the MRND. He was introduced as a leader of the Interahamwe and given the floor to address the crowd alongside the MRND leadership. At least once, he was greeted with a standing ovation. That's a pen portrait of who Kabuga was. Now for a brief overview of the events that culminated in the genocide. In 1994, Rwanda was divided into 11 prefectures. In the geographic center was the capital, Kigali. To the northwest, bordering Zaire, was Gisenyi Prefecture. Nearly all of the crimes charged in this case took place either in Kigali, where Kabuga lived, or Gisenyi, where he spent significant time during the genocide. To Gisenyi's east, bordering Uganda, were the two other northern prefectures, Ruhengeri and Kabuga's native Byumba. South of Gisenyi was Kibuye, where crimes were also committed with Kabuga's support. Below the prefectural level were three administrative divisions. Prefectures were made up of communes. Communes were made up of sectors. Sectors were made up of cellules. Rwanda was also divided by ethnicity. In 1994, there were three principal ethnic groups. The Hutu, accounting for around 90% of the population. The Tutsi, accounting for around 9% of the population. And the Twa, accounting for around 1% of the population. Prior to independence in 1962, Rwanda was governed by a Tutsi monarchy under Belgian colonial rule. In 1959, violence broke out between Hutu and Tutsi in what became known as the Hutu Revolution. Large numbers of Tutsi fled Rwanda for neighboring countries. Post-independence, a Hutu-dominated government was in power. In 1973, a Hutu military commander from Gisenyi Prefecture named Juvenal Habyarimana staged a coup and installed himself as president of Rwanda. Habyarimana formed a political party known as the Mouvement Républicain National pour le Développement, or MRND. Rwanda became a one-party state under MRND control. Every Rwandan citizen was considered a member. The state became closely intertwined with Habyarimana, and personal connections to the president were of paramount importance. A clique of mainly Hutu northerners closest to Habyarimana and his wife Agath Kanziga, known as the Akazu, or Small House, were notorious for their influence. This was the status quo in Rwanda for nearly 2 decades. Then, in the early 1990s, 2 major developments reshaped Rwanda. The first was war. In October 1990, a military force composed primarily of Tutsi refugees from the 1959 revolution invaded Rwanda from their base in Uganda. Armed conflict broke out between the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or the RPF, and the dominated Rwandan armed forces. The government responded by depicting the war as an attempt by Tutsi forces to re-establish the pre-1959 Tutsi monarchy. Tutsi were arbitrarily arrested, and Hutu extremists unleashed a wave of anti-Tutsi sentiment that swept through parts of the majority Hutu population. It found expression in the media, in politics, and even in popular music. The second major development was the advent of multi-partyism after decades of one-party rule. In 1991, Habyarimana succumbed to pressure and amended the constitution to permit the formation of parties other than the MRND. Numerous new parties were created, including the Parti Libéral, or PL, the Mouvement Démocratique Républicain, or the MDR, and the Parti Social Démocratique, or PSD. The MRND was no longer the alter ego of the state and lost exclusive control over government assets and agencies. This included the only nationwide broadcaster, the state-owned Radio Rwanda. Suddenly, the MRND needed new sources of funding and new means to disseminate its message. It turned to the private sector, in particular a small number of wealthy Rwandans with close connections to the president. The MRND's leadership instigated the creation of a 4th major new party, the Coalition pour la Défense de la République, or CDR. The evidence in this trial will show that the CDR was established as an overtly ethnic party meant only for Hutu to protect Hutu interests. The de facto leader of the CDR, and from February 1994 its president, was a man named Jean Bosco Barayagwiza. Multi-partyism also meant that Rwandans were no longer default members of the MRND. In an effort to attract and retain members, all of the political parties established youth wings. The MRND youth wing was called the Interahamwe za MRND, or just Interahamwe. The CDR youth wing was called the Impuzamugambi. Many Interahamwe members wore a colorful uniform made of kitenge, similar to camouflage. Each youth wing held rallies and often used force to compel new members to pledge allegiance to their party. This practice became known as kubohoza. It caused outbursts of violence between the youth groups. Starting in 1992, the Interahamwe began to transform from a youth wing into an armed and trained militia. Members of the Interahamwe and other civilians began receiving military training, firearms, and traditional weapons with the support of the Rwandan army and the MRND leadership. Over the next 2 years, these two trends intensified. The anti-Tutsi sentiment and the rise of an armed and trained militia loyal to the party became gradually intertwined. The Interahamwe were indoctrinated with anti-Tutsi rhetoric, and they shifted their attention from rival youth wings and began attacking and sometimes killing Tutsi civilians and their supposed Hutu sympathizers. The case against Félicien Kabuga is about his uncompromising support for both of these trends, as they escalated first to sporadic ethnic violence and ultimately to genocide. Specifically, the indictment reflects Kabuga's two major contributions to the Rwandan genocide. Firstly, through RTLM, a broadcaster of hate-filled and genocidal messages that played a vital role in priming, unleashing, and then sustaining the genocide. Kabuga founded and ran RTLM together with other leading Hutu extremists, served as RTLM's president throughout its existence, took active steps to ensure its continued operation, and failed to use his authority to prevent further crimes. Secondly, through support for Interahamwe militia in Kigali, in Gisenyi, prior to and during the genocide. And then from mid-April 1994, he both raised funds, including via the Fonds de Défense Nationale, FDN, and he procured, imported, and distributed weapons used to attack Tutsi throughout Rwanda. This support extended to the CDR's party's Impuzamugambi militia and other civilians who were not formally affiliated with the MRND. For someone in Kabuga's position, with Kabuga's connections, these contributions were two sides of the same coin. The two strategies employed by the Hutu extremists to protect the status quo by denouncing and attacking Tutsi. RTLM was the propaganda machine rousing hatred and ultimately violence against the Tutsi, and the Interahamwe receptive to RTLM's rhetoric and trained, armed, and primed to execute it on the ground.
Mr. Elderkin.
Mr. President, Your Honours, thank you. First, RTLM. The dissemination of anti-Tutsi propaganda and its propensity to lead to violence were features of Rwandan history long before Kabuga and others founded RTLM in 1993. For example, with the onset of the armed conflict in October 1990, Kangura magazine warned that the bloodthirsty Tutsi were looking to impose Tutsi domination and exterminate the Hutu elite. Tutsi women married to Hutu men were said to be part of a conspiracy to introduce spies in the most influential Hutu circles. The infamous Hutu 10 Commandments claimed that Tutsi want only ethnic supremacy and derided Hutu who marry or do business with Tutsi as traitors. Hutu had to be firm and vigilant against their common Tutsi enemy. Hutu who failed to answer Kangura's call for unity against the Tutsi likewise came under attack. In 1992, the government began negotiating a peace agreement that accepted power sharing amongst the RPF and the political parties inside Rwanda. Each party, including the RPF, would have seats in the National Assembly and control over designated ministerial posts. This agreement became known as the Arusha Accords. For those dedicated to the idea of Hutu control over Rwanda and benefiting from President Habyarimana's former monopoly over power, the Arusha Accords were a sellout and a betrayal. The Accords aggravated the fear in extremist Hutu circles that the Tutsi were scheming to seize power in Rwanda, and that moderate Hutu were letting them do it. Politicians perceived as moderates became targets for Kangura, for extremists, and even artists aligned to the ideology. Singer and MRND adherent Simon Bikindi wrote songs that targeted Tutsi and preached vigilance against Hutu traitors giving Rwanda away to the Tutsi. The MRND vice president in Gisenyi Prefecture, Leon Mugesera, delivered a blistering speech attacking Hutu opposition politicians and calling for the death penalty against those who betrayed the national interest. He warned his fellow Hutu that the person whose head you have not cut off is the one who will cut off yours, and called for the Tutsi in Rwanda to be cast into the Nyabarongo River. The Tutsi, he explained, were from Ethiopia, and this was the fastest way to send them back to where they came from. Witness Cab 053 will testify that Kabuga was present at Mugesera's speech, and he was introduced as a guest of honor. For this message to reach across Rwanda, the preeminent medium of mass communication was radio. The expert evidence of Rule 112 witness Alison Desforges is that the radio was a key source of information and a focus of social life for ordinary Rwandans in the early 1990s. This was a consequence of the MRND's efforts to subsidize the production and distribution of portable radios in order to enhance their capacity to control and mobilize the population. Before 1993, the only radio station in Rwanda was the government-owned Radio Rwanda. This station was operated by the Office Rwandais d'Information, or ORINFOR, from late 1990 until April 1992. The director of ORINFOR was Ferdinand Nahimana, a prominent academic with a history of overtly anti-Tutsi views. In 1992, Nahimana authorized Radio Rwanda to broadcast a fake communique alleging the existence of a Parti Libéral plot to massacre Hutu. Within days, Interahamwe, supported by the communal leadership, attacked and killed hundreds of Tutsi in the Bugesera area just south of Kigali city. Soon after the Bugesera massacre, Nahimana was fired for his role in the incident. For the Hutu power movement, Nahimana's dismissal from Orinfor left a void on the Rwandan airwaves. Another outlet was needed to get its message on the air, unfettered by the control of the MDR, to whom the Ministry of Information had been allocated. The answer was RTLM. RTLM was set up in a commercial building in central Kigali, opposite one of the president's residences. It was funded by debt financing and shares sold to the public. It was governed internally by its Articles of Association and a statute, adopted by its 50 founding shareholders. Both documents have already been marked for identification as Exhibits P56 and P184. Kabuga played a central role in bringing RTLM into existence. A brand new private radio station, the first of its kind in Rwanda, needed access, money, equipment, and staff. Witnesses Cab 015 and Cab 094, both of whom were closely connected to the RTLM leadership, will give evidence that Kabuga personally led many of these efforts. Between December 1992 and September 1993, he obtained broadcast frequencies from the government, procured transmission equipment, organized debt financing, and registered its Articles of Association with the Ministry of Information. In July 1993, Kabuga chaired RTLM's first and only General Assembly. Standing before a large crowd, Kabuga explained the project before calling on those present to invest money. He also worked behind the scenes to enlist President Habyarimana in the fundraising effort. He put his own money, committing the equivalent of over 10,000 US dollars, some of it to buy shares, but most without receiving any commercial interest in return. And in September 1993, Kabuga signed an agreement as RTLM's president and on its behalf with the Ministry of Information. Article 5.2 of that agreement required RTLM to refrain from broadcasting programs likely to incite hatred. By signing it, Kabuga assumed legal authority and responsibility for ensuring RTLM's compliance with the law. The prosecution will lead evidence that RTLM was intended to contribute to and amplify the anti-Tutsi rhetoric common in Hutu power media from the moment it was founded. The July 1993 edition of Kangura, marked for identification as Exhibit P68, welcomed RTLM with an article entitled RTLM, No Chance for the Tutsi. Kangura explained that RTLM was not primarily a commercial enterprise, but rather a symbol of solidarity for the Hutus, and assured its readers that no single Tutsi has bought shares in RTLM. Kangura singled out Kabuga, whom it described as the richest man in Rwanda, as a key shareholder. No one at RTLM publicly challenged Kangura's portrayal of its mono-ethnic identity. RTLM picked up the mantle of Hutu power propaganda, just as Kangura had touted, rebroadcasting much of the existing anti-Tutsi material. Leon Mugesera's speech, calling for Tutsi to be thrown into the Nyabarongo River to go back to where they came from. Kangura's 10 commandments, instructing Hutu to be vigilant against their common Tutsi enemy. Bikindi's music, including his ironic song, Nanga Abahutu, I Hate the Hutu. All of these and others were broadcast on RTLM, often at moments of heightened ethnic tension, meant to sharpen the message to continue attacking the Tutsi enemy. The key figures with whom Kabuga chose to collaborate in creating RTLM were likewise stalwarts of the Hutu power movement, with virulent and widely publicized anti-Tutsi views. RTLM's key management took the form of a Comité d'Initiative, which was appointed at the July 1993 General Assembly and remained in place as RTLM's sole executive body for the duration of its existence. The three leading figures were Kabuga as its president, Ferdinand Nahimana, the former director of Orinfor, fired for inciting violence against Tutsi at Radio Rwanda, and John Bosco Barriagwiza, the key figure in the Hutu extremist CDR party. Two other members of the committee, Ephraim Nkezebera and Joseph Serugendo, were both members of the Interahamwe National Committee. The managing director was Focus Habimana, another prominent MRND member from Mutura commune in Gisenyi prefecture. RTLM was largely owned by members of the MRND and almost exclusively Hutu. Joseph Nzivorera, the MRND National Secretary, was an important shareholder. As president of RTLM, Kabuga was in charge. Witnesses CAB 031 and CAB 062 will give first-hand evidence that RTLM journalists Georges Rougiou and Noel Hitimana both described Kabuga as their boss. Witness CAB 015 will testify that a member of the Comité d'Initiative named Kabuga as RTLM's highest authority. When RTLM was twice called upon to account for its incendiary broadcasts by the Minister for Information, it was Kabuga who led the delegation on RTLM's behalf, with Nahimana and Barriagwiza at his side, as they all fended off the accusations from the ministry against broadcasts and their journalists. RTLM started broadcasting in July 1993, initially for just a few hours a day. It proved wildly popular, at first in Kigali, and by early 1994, across all of Rwanda. Numerous witnesses will testify that during the genocide, RTLM was ubiquitous. People listened in their homes, in bars, on the streets, and while manning roadblocks. From the 7th of April 1994, RTLM broadcast 24 hours a day, overtaking Radio Rwanda as the country's main radio station. The evidence of RTLM propaganda will come from two sources: testimony from witnesses who listened to RTLM broadcasts live and saw their effects firsthand, and a selection of the broadcasts themselves. The prosecution is in possession of roughly 270 unique recordings of broadcasts, most around 60 minutes long, from dates between October 1993 and July 1994. These broadcasts are generally in Kinyarwanda, but also include portions originally broadcast in French. The totality of the evidence will show that RTLM propaganda became more aggressively hate-filled and more explicitly anti-Tutsi whenever Hutu control over Rwanda came under threat. It reached a critical turning point in October 1993, when Melchior Ndadaye, the first democratically elected Hutu president of neighboring Burundi, was assassinated by the Tutsi-led Burundian military forces. Ndadaye's murder was catapulted into the Rwandan psyche as a warning that the Tutsi were preparing to kill the Hutu and seize power. Within days of Ndadaye's murder, RTLM broadcast a speech delivered by Frodoald Karamira, second vice president of the MDR party and a prominent Hutu power leader. Taking advantage of the fear and insecurity caused by Ndadaye's death, Karamira warned the crowd at Nyamirambo Stadium in Kigali of Tutsi designs on Rwanda and RPF infiltrators inside the country. He attacked moderate Hutu politicians by name, warning, "The enemy is within us." He ended his speech by chanting the words "Hutu power" in a call and answer session with the crowd, and naming political parties with the word power after them. His final words were, "The Hutu is power." Karamira's speech confirmed the emergence of a Hutu power faction in Rwanda, dedicated to preserving Hutu control at all costs. RTLM adopted this rhetoric, and the broadcasts focused heavily on ethnicity and the idea of infiltration by the RPF, its accomplices, and the Tutsi in Rwanda. Like Kengura, RTLM cast the war with the RPF as an ethnic struggle between the Hutu and the Tutsi, deliberately blurring the line between the Tutsi and the RPF. By the end of November 1993, RTLM described the RPF as an ethnic organization. In February 1994, RTLM bluntly declared that the Tutsis and the RPF are the same. And in mid-May 1994, RTLM called the war between the RAF and the RPF a struggle between two ethnic groups, the Hutu and the Tutsi. RTLM warned its listeners that this external force posed a grave danger to the Hutu. Comparable to Nazi propaganda about Jews, in late December 1993, RTLM told listeners that the Tutsi are already the ones who have all the money. Now they wanted control of the country. In March 1994, RTLM warned that the RPF would take back the power that the Hutus seized from them, the Tutsi, and exterminate the Hutu if it had to. The evidence will show that much of RTLM's propaganda was couched in subtle innuendo that both dehumanized and attacked the Tutsi without naming them directly. RTLM used key words to describe the enemy, such as Inkotanyi, Inyenzi, and Ibitso, that were effectively equated with the Tutsi ethnic group at large. Prosecution expert witness Evariste Ntakirutimana, a professor of sociolinguistics who lived through the genocide and listened to RTLM, explains the meaning of these and other words and phrases in the context in which they were used by RTLM. RTLM often claimed that the enemy was the Inyenzi. Ntakirutimana explains that the word Inyenzi literally means cockroach, but was also common slang for a Tutsi guerrilla force, possibly because of a cockroach's capacity to evade danger. The broadcasts will show that RTLM moved so seamlessly between the words Tutsi, RPF, and Inyenzi that it portrayed the Tutsi simultaneously as subhuman vermin and a foreign invading force. RTLM alternatively referred to the enemy using the word Inkotanyi. He explains that while the primary definition of Inkotanyi was the RPF, it was used on RTLM to designate any member of the Tutsi ethnic group and any RPF sympathizer. RTLM likewise created the hybrid phrase, Inkotanyi Inyenzi, which obscured any positive connotation associated with Inkotanyi and associated the RPF and Tutsi civilians with the subhuman cockroach. Another major target on RTLM were the Isiitso, or in the plural, Ibiitso. Ntakirutimana explains that Isiitso literally means accomplice, and that was understood by those listening to RTLM to mean any person on the side of the Tutsi. On RTLM, the Isiitso therefore became equivalent to an Inyenzi or Inkotanyi, all synonyms for the Tutsi and their supporters. Rwandans understood. In the course of this trial, you will hear witness after witness testify that they knew RTLM's target was the Tutsi and those Hutu accused of supporting them. This is set out in the report of Jean-François Dupaquier, a leading expert on Rwanda media who previously co-authored an expert report admitted before the ICTR in the Nahimana case, and who has studied RTLM for decades. His report will take you through dozens of broadcasts, explain their political context, dissect their language, and demonstrate that RTLM systematically targeted and incited violence against Tutsi and those Hutu considered disloyal to the Hutu power cause. The so-called RPF accomplices soon grew to include the United Nations peacekeepers deployed to Rwanda to maintain security and monitor compliance with the Arusha Accords. In December 1993, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Rwanda, UNAMIR, began operations in Kigali. Within UNAMIR, there was a contingent from Belgium. The Belgians, along with UNAMIR Force Commander Romeo Dallaire, quickly became RTLM's targets, accused of siding with the RPF or Tutsi. As political and ethnic violence escalated in early 1994, RTLM ratcheted up the pressure against the Tutsi and their accomplices. On the 5th of January, the power-sharing government contemplated by the Arusha Accords was scheduled to be sworn in. Following months of incessant attacks against the Accords, on the morning of the 5th of January, RTLM warned that the swearing in would be a decisive moment in the power struggle ongoing since 1959. Interahamwe and other armed groups physically prevented representatives of factions opposed to Hutu power from entering the parliament building, and the transitional government never took power. RTLM defended the violence, asking why the swearing in was important to begin with. In February, Félicien Gatabazi, president of the opposition PSD party, was assassinated in Kigali. The next day, a crowd of Gatabazi supporters killed CDR president Martin Bukyana in retaliation. Without any proof, RTLM blamed both murders on the RPF, and MRND and CDR supporters retaliated by killing 70 Tutsi and opposition party members in Kigali. In late March, a senior member of the Impuza Mugambi, known by his nickname Katumba, was murdered. RTLM once again called for Hutu to stand up to the Tutsi, and the Interahamwe again retaliated, attacking Tutsi in Kigali. Many were killed or forced to flee. On the 6th of April 1994, President Habyarimana's plane was shot down. RTLM's hate-filled rhetoric transformed immediately into constant, frenzied, overt calls for extermination. Over the next 3 months, RTLM called on Rwandans to kill the Inkotanyi and exterminate them because they belong to one ethnic group. It asked who would exterminate the Tutsi from the surface of the earth to make them disappear for good. It warned that the Hutu will fight them endlessly and follow them into the countries where they fled. It assured listeners that these people will never escape us until we exterminate them. And I would like to play a couple of clips from RTLM broadcasts of that period. For the interpreter's information, there are accompanying subtitles in English, and the audio itself is in Kinyarwanda.
If you're a cockroach, you must be killed. You cannot change anything. If you're an Intoyaki, you cannot change anything. No one can say he has captured a cockroach and the latter gave him money. As a price for his life, this cannot be accepted. If someone has a false identity card, if he's an Intokoyani, a known accomplice of RPF, don't accept anything in exchange. He must be killed. Deuxième. 100,000 young men must be recruited and get up together, and then we kill and will exterminate Intoyaki. Especially the reason why we will exterminate them is that they belong to one ethnic group. It is to look at the structure, at the stature, and physical appearance of a person. It is to look at the small nose and destroy it, and then you go up to Kimbongo, Razumaru, Bengan everywhere. We will pause after having liberated our country.
For RTLM, even these overt calls for general extermination were not enough. Journalists on RTLM explained the need to search for and locate the Inkotanyi and their accomplices, even broadcasting locations where individuals or groups of Inyenzi could be found. Many of these locations were places of worship, where civilians fleeing the violence believed they might be safe. Nyami Rambo, a sector in the southwest of Kigali with numerous religious institutions, was an important target. At least 7 witnesses will give evidence from inside Nyami Rambo's churches and mosques, describing the unarmed men, women, and children who streamed terrified into those religious sites, only to be chased down, attacked, and killed at RTLM's urging. One of these witnesses, Cab 113, kept a contemporaneous diary that has been marked for identification as Exhibit P94. The diary documents the flow of refugees into Nyami Rambo's religious sites as it happened. RTLM's broadcasts falsely claiming that RPF soldiers were hiding there, and the waves of attacks that followed. 3 different survivors and a 4th eyewitness will give evidence that on or around the 12th of April 1994, they heard RTLM claim on air that armed Inyenzi were hiding inside the Islamic Cultural Center in Nyami Rambo. The next day, armed soldiers and Interahamwe entered the compound, rounded up hundreds of unarmed, terrified civilians, and executed them en masse. You will hear RTLM broadcasts naming the Islamic Center and the Gaddafi Mosque located inside that compound. When RTLM did not know where Tutsi were hiding, it tricked them into revealing themselves. Witness Cab 092 will testify that he personally heard RTLM announce that people in hiding should return to their homes. Several of his neighbors complied and were promptly killed by Interahamwe. One was Abdullah Rubaiza, a Tutsi civilian. A group of Interahamwe dragged Rubaiza from his house soon after he arrived and executed him 200 meters away. Then they entered his house and killed his wife and children. One of the Interahamwe noticed that Rubaiza's 1-year-old infant was smiling. The Interahamwe scoffed, "Look at this Inyenzi," as he covered the child in dirt to bury them alive. You will also hear testimony and review broadcasts showing that RTLM directed the Interahamwe to attack specific people by naming them on air. Numerous witnesses will state that when they heard someone's name on RTLM, they knew that person was a target. Witness Cab 043 heard his name on air, and soldiers soon started looking for him. Witness Cab 037 heard his name on RTLM and understood it as a death threat. Witness Monique Mujawamaria was a prominent human rights activist. Beginning in December 1993, RTLM repeatedly named her as a tool of the enemy. She will testify that shortly after each broadcast, she was threatened or physically assaulted by Impuza Mugambi and other militiamen. On one occasion, she received a message threatening to crucify her, remove her skin, and leave her to be eaten by birds. On another occasion, her assailant pulled out his penis to threaten her. On yet another occasion, the assailants attacked her car whilst she was in it. After Habyarimana's plane went down and the killings started, soldiers kicked in Ms. Mujawamaria's door, shooting as they entered. She narrowly escaped death by going into hiding and eventually found a way out of Rwanda. Numerous killings charged in the indictment concern victims named on RTLM and thereafter killed by soldiers and Interahamwe following the journalist's instructions. For example, you will hear evidence from witness Cab 030 that he heard RTLM identify a family member as an Inyenzi on the 7th of April. The family member, a civilian, was immediately arrested with his wife and 7 children and executed. You will hear from Francois Xavier Nsanzuwera that RTLM named Desiree Nshunguyinka as an Inkotanyi and read out his car's number plate on air. That same day, Nshunguyinka's car was stopped at a roadblock. He and his relatives were taken from the car and killed. Witness Cab 081 will testify that on the 14th of April, RTLM journalist Cantino named Theonest Gafaranga, a prominent politician, as a big accomplice and asked why no one had seen Gafaranga's body. 2 days later, a group of Interahamwe arrested Gafaranga and took him to RTLM's premises to show off their prize. According to witness Cab 012, soon afterwards, he saw Interahamwe execute Gafaranga at a roadblock. You will hear evidence that journalist Noel Hitimana saw Second Lieutenant Desiree Mudenge escorting a group of Tutsi to safety and broadcast his name on RTLM. Mudenge was promptly stopped at a roadblock in his car and killed along with all of his passengers. You will see the written excerpt of a broadcast by journalist Valerie Bemeriki, falsely claiming that a priest named Father Ngoga was shooting at Hutu. According to witnesses Cab 051 and Cab 054, within days, Ngoga was arrested and then left in the hands of an angry mob. He was massacred on the spot. Witness Cab 087 was manning a roadblock in Gisenyi, near the border with Zaire, when he heard that RTLM named Stanislas Sinibagiwe as an RPF accomplice and announced that he was in Gisenyi. Cab 087 personally arrested Sinibagiwe trying to cross into Zaire and handed him to the Interahamwe. Sinibagiwe was taken away and executed. Several witnesses will testify that a man named Daniel Kabuga was accused on the 14th of April by RTLM of hiding in Kotanyi. 2 hours later, dozens of soldiers and Interahamwe sought him out. They shot Kabuga in the head and shot his daughter 6 times. RTLM specifically targeted Tutsi women, conveying the message that Tutsi women were seductive agents of the enemy. These broadcasts incited widespread acts of rape, mutilation, and other acts of sexual violence against Tutsi women. You will hear RTLM broadcasts warning that the RPF was using beautiful women of loose morals to trick Hutu men into ceding power to the RPF. They called Tutsi women prostitutes and told listeners to taste women before killing them. The results were horrific. A Tutsi woman named Félicien was named on RTLM before she was caught, stripped naked, raped and murdered by Interahamwe. RTLM updated its listeners on the progress of the attack on the day she was killed and stated, after it was finished, that all Tutsi women should be treated the same way. The evidence of witness Cab 089 and of expert witness Benaifa Nauraji, who have interviewed numerous victims of sexual assault from the Rwandan genocide, is that this experience was widespread and systematic. Cab 089 estimates that between 250 and 500,000 women were raped during the genocide. Kabuga and the RTLM Comité d'Initiative set these deadly broadcasts in motion by launching RTLM as the voice of Hutu power in the midst of spiraling ethnic tensions. Loyal journalists amplified the propaganda. The goal of the whole enterprise was criminal, and each member of the joint criminal enterprise contributed according to their role and means. For Kabuga, that was providing leadership, corporate governance, fundraising, and political influence. Above all, he ensured that RTLM remained on air throughout its existence. When RTLM's rhetoric became more vehemently hateful after the assassination of the Burundian president in October 1993, the Ministry of Information took notice. The ministry's interest was rooted in RTLM's agreement with the Ministry of Information, requiring it to refrain from broadcasting programs which were likely to incite hatred, violence, or any other form of division. On the 25th of October 1993, the ministry sent a letter addressed to Kabuga warning RTLM that it was in violation of that agreement. The letter has been marked for identification as Exhibit P171. Kabuga responded by defending RTLM, twice representing RTLM at meetings with Minister of Information Faustin Rucogoza in November 1993 and again in February 1994, both times with Nahimane and Bariaguiza at his side. You will hear first-hand evidence about both meetings from two senior officials at the Ministry of Information. One of these officials, witness Cab 005, monitored RTLM closely in advance of the meetings and kept a record of RTLM's incendiary broadcasts. When Kabuga was confronted with that evidence at the first meeting on the 26th of November 1993, he insisted that RTLM could satisfy only one ethnic group and had the right to tell the truth. At the second meeting, on the 10th of February 1994, Kabuga was again confronted with examples of RTLM's hateful broadcasts. Part of this meeting was video recorded, and I'll now play a short extract, again with English subtitles and the audio in Kinyarwanda.
As we indicated, RTLM cannot please everyone. There are many political parties in Rwanda, so that when it reports that someone has done something, the person will complain. If it says that the Ikoyane have gone out of the CDND, opened fire, killing one or several people and wounding others, should this constitute an insult? This actually happened. Is it reports that Dallaire has said that the Into Kotani did was to shoot in the air? Is this harassing him? If it says that the UNAMR soldiers, and I don't know whether they're Belgians, I only hear of UNAMR, have met a girl driving, if such is the case, and punctured her tires, and if this is the case, why should not report it? Honorable Minister, RTML reports the facts that it can observe. That is his raison d'être, to enlighten the population. You think it is biased? They engage in these acts, but do not want them reported on RTLM. Why should we expect RTLM not to broadcast what Radio Rwanda cannot air? If we continue being softy, what will then be the use of the press? Should we report?
That at this meeting, Kabuga also accused the ministry itself of being an enemy accomplice. Kabuga dared Minister Rucogoza to shut down RTLM if he thought he could. Kabuga largely denied wrongdoing on RTLM's behalf. However, he admitted that the Comité d'Initiative had the power to stop the broadcasts if it wanted. Contemporaneous notes of the November 1993 meeting show that Kabuga said that RTLM management was trying to correct what he called RTLM's mistakes. He gave an example of a broadcast that was retracted because it was untrue. This evidence will corroborate two witnesses close to the Comité d'Initiative who will give first-hand evidence that RTLM journalists took instructions multiple times from Ephraim Nkezebera, a member of the committee subordinate to Kabuga. On one occasion, Nkezebera instructed a journalist to retract an accusation against someone who had been identified on air as an RPF accomplice. The journalist immediately complied. When Kabuga was challenged over inflammatory RTLM broadcasts and extremist propaganda, he robustly defended the radio station and helped it evade efforts to stop it from inciting violence. He remained RTLM's president through to the end of the genocide, legally obliged under Rwandan law to prevent broadcasts likely to stir ethnic violence. Instead, he enabled RTLM to incite and sustain the violence, even as hundreds of thousands of Rwandans were attacked, raped, and killed. After the killings started on the 7th of April 1994, Kabuga continued in his role as president of RTLM to support the broadcasts. On the 17th of April, the RTLM studios in central Kigali were hit by an artillery shell and temporarily went off air. Kabuga rushed to the scene. Witness Cab 032 was an important local government official in central Kigali. He will testify that he saw Kabuga at the RTLM offices after the shelling and heard him encourage the journalists to continue facing up to the Inyenzi. When Kabuga discovered that RTLM journalist Noel Hitimana had been seriously injured in that shelling, he went to the Red Cross hospital where Hitimana was being treated. Witness Cab 031 will testify that she got to know Hitimana while at the hospital and that she saw Kabuga visit Hitimana there on 3 occasions. After the first of those visits, Hitimana told Cab 031 that his visitor was Kabuga and described Kabuga as his boss. Cab 031 heard Kabuga tell Hitimana about a store of weapons in Gikondo, a location in Kigali where Kabuga had a large commercial warehouse facility. Cab 031 saw Kabuga give Hitimana a bundle of money. She will testify that on the 3rd visit, Kabuga took Hitimana away with him. Witness Cab 021 will also testify that he knew Kabuga well and, at Kabuga's request, donated 10,000 Rwandan francs to a collection in May 1994 while he was in Gisenyi. That contribution is recorded on a document seized from Kabuga in 1997 and marked for identification as Exhibit P126. The title at the top of the list of contributions is Dos Hitimana Noel, seemingly indicating that the collection was for the injured journalist. Throughout the existence of RTLM, Kabuga was unwavering in keeping the message of Hutu power on air, with all the consequences for the genocide that this entailed. That brings me to the second main component of the case against Kabuga, his direct support to the Interahamwe, the key perpetrators of the genocide, alongside the military, in the form of money, weapons, and moral encouragement. The evidence will show that his contributions predated the 6th of April 1994 and escalated significantly as the killings progressed. A little history. From its founding in 1991, the Interahamwe was run by a national committee composed of 5 principal members. One was Secretary General Eugene Mbarushimana, who married one of Kabuga's daughters. Another was First Vice President Phineas Ruhumuriza, who lived close to Kabuga's compound in the Kimironko sector of Kigali and, like Kabuga, had a group of Interahamwe based at his residence. You will hear that Ruhumuriza's Interahamwe and Kabuga's Interahamwe groups joined forces in targeting and killing Tutsi in and around Kimironko during the genocide. Witnesses will testify that Kabuga was an active and prominent supporter of both the MRND and the Interahamwe. He provided the equivalent of thousands of US dollars in financial support, and he spoke at public rallies in their defense. He championed their cause with President Habyarimana and helped persuade Habyarimana to raise money on their behalf. For a time in the early 1990s, Kabuga gave both the MRND and the Interahamwe offices as well as training grounds in the large building he owned in the Muhima sector of Kigali. Kabuga is charged with crimes arising from his support for the Interahamwe, principally in 3 locations: his Muhima building and his Kimironko residence, both in Kigali, and in Gisenyi Prefecture, where he was based for a substantial part of the genocide. Starting with Muhima. There, Kabuga's building served as both a national headquarters for the MRND and the Interahamwe, and as a meeting point for Interahamwe and the closely associated Impuzamugambi in the local area. Many of these local Interahamwe had moved to Kigali in the late 1980s from Kabuga's native prefecture of Byumba to work on the construction of Kabuga's Muhima building. They settled in the area and began attending meetings and training at the building. They were fed anti-Tutsi propaganda and sang songs about exterminating the Tutsi. Witness Cab 114 will testify that in January 1994, Kabuga himself promised them weapons. Once the genocide started, local Interahamwe participating in the killings used the Muhima building to rest, to get uniforms, and to restock food and supplies. You will hear eyewitness evidence from witness Cab 117 that Interahamwe converged at the Muhima building on the morning of the 7th of April and were loaded onto vehicles belonging to Kabuga. Félicien Kabuga himself arrived in the building's courtyard, dressed in Interahamwe kitenge. He spoke to several detained Tutsi men and then to the Interahamwe who were guarding them. Kabuga left the site, and soon after, those Tutsi men were taken away in a truck. The attacks on Tutsi in Muhima continued for several more weeks, and the Interahamwe, who trained at Kabuga's building, were among the most violent perpetrators. You will hear evidence about a Tutsi man living nearby who was attacked and killed on the 8th of April. The killers then captured and raped his pregnant wife and 2 female cousins. For weeks, his cousins were shuttled from one house to the next and raped every day by a succession of Interahamwe. A witness recognized the perpetrators as Biumba natives from Kabuga's building. Kabuga also established and supported a group of Interahamwe where he lived, in the Kimironko sector of Kigali. They were based in Kabuga's large residential compound, which they used for meetings and training. 4 former members of Kabuga's Kimironko Interahamwe will give evidence in these proceedings. They will testify that Kabuga supported them with money, uniforms, and transportation, that they were indoctrinated to kill Tutsi during trainings at Kabuga's compound, and that they killed and harmed Tutsi during the genocide. You will hear evidence that Kabuga's Kimironko Interahamwe numbered around 50 members. Their leader was named Haja Bakiga. They had a vice chairman named Gerard Sehene and a treasurer, Gracien Murenzi. Like the Interahamwe in Muhima, most of the Kimironko Interahamwe were from Kabuga's native prefecture of Biumba. Some worked as guards or drivers on Kabuga's property. Witness Cab 069 will testify that Kabuga invited him into the compound and personally told him that he founded and supported the Interahamwe group. Cab 069 will testify that he saw Kabuga surrounded by his Interahamwe and that they treated him like their president. Witness Cab 041 lived in Kimironko, close to Kabuga's compound, and will describe its size and location. On the screen, you will see a satellite image of the neighborhood, highlighting locations identified by Cab 041. Kabuga's compound is the large rectangle on the right-hand side of the image, outlined in yellow. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a roundabout known as Groupement. As we will see momentarily, the evidence will show that during the genocide, there was a roadblock at Groupement, infamous as a site for arresting Tutsi civilians. Kabuga also supported another group of Interahamwe based a few hundred meters from his compound at a property owned by Phineas Ruhumaliza, the first vice president of the Interahamwe National Committee. You will hear evidence from multiple former members of Kabuga's Interahamwe that the two groups cooperated closely both before and during the genocide, and that Kabuga's support extended to Ruhumaliza's group. Kabuga began arming his Interahamwe as early as 1993 with the same kinds of weapons that were later used to kill Tutsi during the genocide. Witness Cab 072 was a neighbor living close to Kabuga's compound. He will testify that in 1993, he entered the compound and saw the Interahamwe carrying guns, clubs, machetes, and grenades. The evidence of witness Cab 049, who worked inside the compound, is that she saw Kabuga stockpiling machetes and other traditional weapons in January 1994. When the weapons arrived, she heard Kabuga say that they would be used to finish off the Inyenzi. These armed Interahamwe were trained at Kabuga's compound and taught anti-Tutsi propaganda. Kabuga's neighbor, Cab 072, will testify that before the genocide, he saw soldiers enter the compound, and he heard gunshots from inside the compound while they were there. Former Kimironko Interahamwe members, Cab 070 and Cab 046, will acknowledge the Interahamwe were trained. Cab 046 will testify that the final objective of the training was the perpetration of the killings. Witness Cab 085 lived close to Kimironko. As the Interahamwe left Kabuga's compound, he would hear them singing Tuba Tsemba Tsembe, which translates literally to "Let us exterminate them." Kabuga came to watch the Interahamwe training at least twice, in late 1993 and early 1994. Roadblocks used to identify and arrest Tutsi started going up even before the genocide. Witness Cab 055 lived in Kimironko and was friends with many of Kabuga's Interahamwe. According to his evidence, a roadblock was set up before the 6th of April at the Groupement roundabout, just a few hundred meters from Kabuga's compound and close by Ruhumaliza's property. The Groupement roadblock was manned by both Kabuga's and Ruhumaliza's Interahamwe, including Cab 055's friends. And it was notorious as the most dangerous in all of Kimironko. More roadblocks went up as soon as the genocide started, many of them manned by Kabuga's Interahamwe searching for Tutsi. Former members of Kabuga's Interahamwe will testify that they emerged from the Kimironko compound early in the morning of the 7th of April 1994. They set up roadblocks and began killing. Witness Cab 045, who ran a business in Kimironko, will testify that he saw Kabuga's Interahamwe exit Kabuga's compound armed with machetes and guns. They went around Kimironko, urging residents to get their machetes and find Inyenzi. Witness Cab 028 was a Tutsi resident of Kimironko and knew many of Kabuga's Interahamwe. He saw the leaders attack Tutsi families, including his own. Some victims, like the unarmed civilian Jean-Pierre Nzaramba, were killed at a roadblock set up by Kabuga's Interahamwe near the entrance to Kabuga's compound. Two of Kabuga's Interahamwe will testify to Nzaramba's murder, including witness Cab 025, who saw Nzaramba abducted from his home by members of Kabuga's group. Cab 041 was a Tutsi civilian living 200 meters from Kabuga's compound and knew many of the Interahamwe group. Soon after the 7th of April, he hid with several others in the attic of a neighbor's house. The house was soon attacked by 20 people, including at least 3 members of Kabuga's Interahamwe, whose voices Cab 041 recognized. When 2 brothers hiding with Cab 041 tried to leave, they were captured. From his hiding spot, Cab 041 saw the Interahamwe escort the brothers to a courtyard and hack them to death with machetes. Cab 070 and Cab 046, both former members of Kabuga's Interahamwe, will testify to their own participation in the killings. Cab 070 will admit that he was among 30 Interahamwe and soldiers who attacked Sahaha and Joseph Kayijuka at around 2 p.m. on the 7th of April. Cab 070 will identify several of Kabuga's Interahamwe who participated in the attacks and testify that both victims were killed only because they were Tutsi. Cab 046 will testify that he was among a smaller group of Kabuga's Interahamwe who killed a woman named Mukandahiro at her home along with her 2 children in mid-April 1994. Kabuga personally encouraged the killings. Witness Cab 065 was a radio technician who had worked for Kabuga and knew him professionally and personally. He will testify that after the 7th of April, he passed through Groupement, the deadly roadblock near Kabuga's house. He saw Kabuga there and recognized Muga Bonake and Munyakazi, both members of Kabuga's Interahamwe. Cab 065 heard Kabuga warn the many Interahamwe manning the roadblock about Tutsi infiltrators. Kabuga pledged support for the Interahamwe, and he personally distributed weapons. As the killings escalated, hundreds of unarmed civilians, including residents of the Kimironko neighborhood, sought refuge in the Karama school and the Adopea Pentecostal Church. Cab 041 lived in Kimironko, close to Kabuga's compound, and took refuge in the church on the 10th of April. He will testify that the 2 sites were in the same area and not far from Kabuga's compound. The school was visible from the church and vice versa. Kabuga's Interahamwe chased down the fleeing refugees, first targeting Karama School with 24 armed Interahamwe. Tutsi were separated from Hutu and killed en masse. When refugees from the school fled to the church, the same Interahamwe followed them and continued killing unarmed Tutsi civilians. You will hear eyewitness evidence about the attacks from witnesses Cab 002, 028, 035, and 041, all victims who took refuge in either the church or the school. Cab 028 lived in Kimironko and recognized Hajabakiga and Sehene among the leaders of the attack. you will hear corroborating evidence from Cab 046, a member of Kabuga's Interahamwe, who learned of the attacks from his brother, one of the perpetrators. As the genocide progressed and the fighting intensified, the RPF began taking control of parts of Kigali, and leading government figures started leaving the city. On the 12th of April, the interim government first relocated to Murambi in Gitarama Prefecture, and then eventually settled in Gisenyi town. In mid-April, Kabuga set up a base in Gisenyi town. Focusing on much-needed fundraising, he held meetings which led to the setting up of the Fonds de Défense Nationale, or FDN, a fund to buy weapons. For the rest of the genocide, he was at the forefront of efforts to procure and supply weapons, money, and transportation to that genocide openly in progress. Kabuga's contributions to the genocide took place in Gisenyi at a number of key locations within very short distances, mostly in Gisenyi town. He held multiple fundraisers at the Meridian Hotel on the shores of Lake Kivu. The weapons he procured and supplied were distributed at least twice at the MRND office, opposite the lake, just down the road from the Meridian. Border crossings with Zaire were just a few hundred meters away. Kabuga imported weapons into Rwanda from the Zairean border town of Goma. Many of these weapons were unloaded and distributed at Gisenyi military camp in the center of the town, sometimes with Kabuga's participation. Kabuga also held rallies and distributed weapons at the Umuganda Sports Stadium, a short drive from the Meridian Hotel. Just behind and within sight of the stadium was an existing cemetery used as the primary execution site in Gisenyi during the genocide. The killers who perpetrated the genocide showed their penchant for morbid humor by nicknaming the cemetery Commune Rouge, referencing the color of blood. Kabuga collaborated with leading authorities executing the genocide in Gisenyi to funnel his support directly to the physical perpetrators. Colonel Anatole Nsengiyumva was the highest-ranking military officer based in Gisenyi. Bernard Munyagishari was president of the Gisenyi Interahamwe. Barnab Samvura was chairman of the CDR in Gisenyi and head of the Impuzamugambi. Together, they led the military and militia forces who oversaw and carried out the genocide in Gisenyi. Captain or Lieutenant Bizumuremyi, a Rwandan army officer under Nsengiyumva's command, played a major role in importing and distributing weapons to the perpetrators. Kabuga began supplying weapons to the Gisenyi Interahamwe even before he relocated to the town. Twice in early April 1994, large groups of Interahamwe and Impuzamugambi gathered outside the MRND office in Gisenyi to receive weapons. Samvura and Bizumuremyi both told the crowd that the weapons had been sent by Kabuga, and a truck bearing Kabuga's initials transported some of the weapons. Witness Cab 066 was an Impuzamugambi member who will testify to having unloaded weapons provided by Kabuga that were distributed to Interahamwe in Gisenyi around the beginning of the genocide. Witness Cab 067 was an Interahamwe member who witnessed both of these weapons distributions. He will testify that the Interahamwe and Impuzamugambi began killing in Gisenyi on the morning of the 7th of April, just after the second weapons distribution at the MRND office. The weapons were used to kill Tutsi civilians across Gisenyi town, including at roadblocks in Muduha and Bugoyi cellules. Once in Gisenyi, Kabuga moved quickly to raise funds to sustain the genocide. On the 24th and 25th of April, Kabuga convened a meeting at the Meridian Hotel as president of the new initiative called the Fonds de Défense Nationale, FDN. Together with a group of prominent Gisenyi businessmen, Kabuga agreed to establish the FDN to raise funds to buy weapons to support the fight against the enemy. Witnesses Cab 074 and Cab 104 both attended the meeting. Cab 074 will testify that Kabuga took the floor and identified the enemy as the Inyenzi, which the witness understood to mean the Tutsi population. The FDN was run by a provisional committee led by Kabuga as president, together with Abija Kwilingira and Stanislav Harelimana, both leading Gisenyi businessmen. 4 other prominent figures, Matthias Niegazaza, Augustin Basebia, Gérard Nsenga, and Pastor Musabe, had signing authority over the FDN accounts. After the 25th of April meeting, the Provisional Committee led by Kabuga signed a letter addressed to the government. The committee announced the creation of the FDN, thanked the army for its role in fighting the enemy and its accomplices, and called for training and arming for Rwandan youth. Kabuga signed a second letter addressed to the Prime Minister, calling for nationwide contributions and providing information of 2 bank accounts in FDN's name, in which the equivalent of over $30,000 had already been collected. Those letters are marked for identification as Exhibits P43 and P44. Over the next 2 months, Kabuga was a fixture at public meetings and rallies held in Gisenyi town, raising money for the Interahamwe and encouraging continued attacks against the Tutsi and RPF accomplices. Kabuga denounced the Tutsi enemy at a meeting at the Gisenyi MRND office. He encouraged cooperation between Interahamwe and Impuzamugambi in defeating the Tutsi enemy at a rally at Umuganda Stadium. He presided over a meeting at the Gisenyi Prefectural Hall, raising funds to purchase weapons to exterminate the Inyenzi. He demanded to know at another meeting at the MRND office why Tutsi were being allowed to flee across the border and promised weapons to reinforce roadblocks. He spoke at other rallies and public meetings, addressing audiences ranging from high-ranking national politicians to ordinary Interahamwe. His message was consistent. The Tutsi must be killed, and he, Kabuga, was hard at work gathering the money and the weapons needed to get that done. For a final word on Kabuga's role in establishing the FDN, an RTLM broadcast from the 17th of June praising Kabuga, along with other traders, for raising money to help their cause, will now be played, again with English subtitles, audio in Kinyarwanda.
We would obtain weapons while a quick procurement of ammunition is underway. That would be done while ways and means and setting things right are being found. All the business people could. There are other businessmen too from Gisenyi. There were even business people from Gitarama. They were present, the likes of Emmanuel, Mukeka, Edward, the likes on the whole. They all agreed to contribute money. Each one of them pledged a certain amount, but the minimum offered was about 1 million. All this was aimed at trying to save our country. Indeed, all the business people are saying, in any case, to do business, you need a secure base. Money is useless. The country, your money would be of no use to you if your country is taken by foreigners. Therefore, I hope that all the business people, wherever they are following the example of Gisenyi, the example of all those business people who came together in Gisenyi and collected money to fund the army, the radio stations, the media. This will enable journalists to travel abroad and tell people the reality, explain even to their colleagues. They will be able to go on mission to Europe. The situation, I was told, those are some of the expenses this money will cover. Not forgetting the military, not forgetting the salaries of the soldiers. Mercenaries will be hired, white men. In short, all the troops capable of proving their worth on the battlefield.
Probably need another 10 minutes to finish, which I know takes us a few minutes over 2 hours. I'd ask for your guidance, please. Should I finish up now, or is...
Maître Altit, do you see any problem about continuing?
No objection, Your Honor.
Thank you. Yeah, please carry on, Mr. Eldekin.
Kabuga was not content merely to raise funds and denounce Tutsi. He actively participated in procuring and importing weapons. These efforts were part of a deliberate plan to circumvent an arms embargo prohibiting weapons sales to the Rwandan government. You will hear evidence that the weapons landed at Goma airport. Soldiers and Interahamwe travelled the short distance several times from Gisenyi town across the border to collect the shipments. 4 witnesses who participated in these missions and others who observed or helped organize them will testify in this trial. They will give eyewitness accounts that place Kabuga either at Goma airport, where the weapons arrived, or in Gisenyi, where they were unloaded from vehicles and distributed. They will describe Kabuga's trucks bearing his initials being used to go from Gisenyi to Goma and returning carrying weapons. They will describe seeing dozens of boxes containing Kalashnikovs, R4 rifles, grenades, and ammunition. Witness Cab 009 will testify that Impuza Mugambi, who received weapons from the distribution, was sent to Bisesero in Kibuye prefecture to kill Tutsi civilians, thousands of whom fled to those hills to make a last stand to survive. The killers told him about those attacks after they returned. You will hear evidence that Kabuga personally distributed weapons used to kill Tutsi. Witness Cab 048 will testify that he and other Interahamwe received machetes, guns, and grenades from Kabuga, Nsemgiyumva, and Bizumuremyi at Gisenyi military camp in May 1994. Once the weapons were distributed, Kabuga told them to finish their job. Cab 048 and the other Interahamwe used the weapons to kill Tutsi civilians across Gisenyi, including at San Fidel Institute and Nyeri bus terminal. By July of 1994, the end of the genocide, Gisenyi was almost entirely cleansed of Tutsi, with the RPF advancing across ever more Rwandan territory. Kabuga fled, along with hundreds of thousands of others, into Zaire and onwards. In the 24 years since Kabuga was first indicted, many of the people with whom he is charged with collaborating were prosecuted, pled guilty, and convicted. These include Ferdinand Nahimana and John Bosco Barriaguiza, who led RTLM alongside Kabuga; Joseph Serugendo, prominent Interahamwe and RTLM technician; news proprietor Hassan Ngeze; RTLM journalists Valerie Bemeriki and Georges Rougiou; the singer Simon Bikindi; and the politician Leon Mugesera, whose genocidal messages were broadcast on RTLM. Anatole Nsemguiumva and Bernard Munyagishari, who distributed weapons imported by Kabuga and led the soldiers and Interahamwe who used them to kill and harm Tutsi and their Hutu sympathizers in Gisenyi; and Faustin Munyakazi and Gracien Murenzi, who did much the same at Kabuga's compound in Kimironko. The trial courts in those cases heard evidence and made findings on many of the allegations in the indictment in this case. The openly violent content of RTLM's broadcasts, the transformation of the Interahamwe from a political youth group into an armed and murderous militia, the importation and distribution of arms to soldiers and Interahamwe, and the hundreds of thousands of killings and acts of sexual violence directed at Tutsi and their supposed accomplices as a consequence of these and other acts. Much of that evidence is the evidence to be presented in the coming weeks and months, together with other evidence, as briefly outlined in this opening statement. It will show that Félicien Kabuga, acting in the cause of extremist beliefs, played a key part in bringing about the crimes and the almost unimaginable suffering that was unleashed across Rwanda in 1994. That concludes the prosecution's opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Elderkin, and also thank you to Mr. Rashid, who presented his introductory part of your submission. That concludes today's hearing. The court will now adjourn until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
All rise.